We are back, episode 54 of Red versus Blue. My name is Mike Stark.
And I'm Keith Curry.
And Keith is back from an extended vacation. That's what we do when we're retired. We follow the politics, but we don't let it get in the way of our real life, right, Keith?
We try not to. It's hard to do these days.
Yeah, very hard to do. So you were out of the country on a cruise ship, right?
We were cruising around the tip of South America to the very southernmost city in the world. And we stopped in the Falkland Islands, where they still celebrate Margaret Thatcher, and finished in Buenos Aires. But we had people from all over the world on the cruise ship. We had 130 plus people from Canada. I can report to our listeners that they are not amused by the whole 51st state thing. In fact, they find it thoroughly and completely offensive. I just saw a poll that shows that 90% of people in Canada oppose being the 51st state, and the 10% are sort of the people here in America who, as they said on CNN, who believe that we never went to the moon. Got some sort of conspiratorial thought. The Liberal Party, the party of Justin Trudeau, had a less than 1% chance of remaining in power in January, but after the kerfuffle about Trump, they now have a 90% chance of retaining power, and the new prime minister is expected to call an election, a snap election here, probably even this week.
Can I stop you there for a second? Because that is pretty amazing that U.S. politics so dramatically affected Canadian politics.
It completely turned the whole thing around, and it basically torpedoed the Conservative Party in Canada. They're now sort of jumping over themselves to see who can be the most anti-Trump. But The guy who's got the job now is pretty well established himself, is riding a wave. And so in Canada, of course, in parliamentary systems, you can decide when the election's going to be. He's going to decide to have it pretty quickly while he's got this popularity and while he can feed off of the Trump situation.
Wow.
But that shows you how deeply unpopular this is in Canada, how offended we have made our neighbors, and how utterly ridiculous this is for American foreign relations that we engage in this nonsense. But that's the effect it's having in Canada. We had passengers from England, France, and Germany, all of whom would slide up to you and give you that look to see if you were as crazy as the people they see on TV. And once they decide that you're not, sit there and go, what the hell happened to your country?
Right.
Tremendous amount of frustration and angst, frankly. And we sat across from an American woman who was from the Washington, D.C. area. She is a person, an executive in the bioterrorism prevention area. She wasn't sure whether she got laid off or not that week because she didn't do her 5 points she had to send to Elon. So very serious issues in terms of the federal workforce, in terms of the government to do its critical tasks, all sort of manifest themselves while we were on the ship.
Okay, let's talk a second about the governmental cuts. We talked about it briefly before. And I think that the talking points of the mega party is there's deep fraud, there's deep abuse, and that they add to the talking point that the Democrats, they don't want those things to be found out. I argue that, yes, we believe that there are fraud, abuse, and everything else in it. We just don't want the guy doing it to be doing it. We want it to be constitutionally done. And as you and I talked about, it's Congress that should be handling this, right?
That's right. There's very well-established processes for appropriating, authorizing, and apportioning federal funds and how government ought to work and spend them. Those are all being ignored. And the guys who are doing the cuts, the 24-year or 19-year-old guy named Big Balls, probably can't, spell the Department of Agriculture. And these are programs that people's lives literally depend upon throughout the country. And there's not the discernment and using a scalpel, because there is plenty of ways to cut. That's the thing about it. Americans want that to be done. But you can't cut critical programs, air traffic controllers, weather people, bioterrorism experts, willy-nilly. It just doesn't work.
So why is the Congress so lame in not dealing with this, since it is their duty?
Well, if it were a Democratic Congress, they would be. If Biden were trying to do this and we had a Republican Congress, they would be all over it. But the House of Representatives in particular has been subjugated by Trump, and they are not going to stand in his way at all. The Senate is apparently pushing back, particularly on defense issues behind closed doors.
Hmm.
and I think is having some impact there. But Congress thinks this is an easy thing to do, and they put themselves in a trick box. I mean, we'll talk about this later about legislation. Congress passed their authorization for spending and their framework for spending, which includes a significant amount of government cuts. And as long as they can keep not defining what those cuts are, and as long as they can keep making Musk and not themselves responsible for them, they get a little bit of cover. And I think that's the dynamic that the people in the House, particularly, are trying to manufacture.
Okay. So if I understand you right, down the line, when the whole thing goes down the tubes, they can blame Elon. They will blame Elon.
They can blame Elon, and for right now, they're able to keep their hands a little bit off of it. I mean, they're not the ones cutting education. He is.
Gotcha.
Eventually, they're going to have to vote on it. But right now, it's not them.
Okay. Got it. All right. We've talked about a few things, but let's talk about the other things that have taken place since we last got together with Trump.
Well, he's had quite a month, hasn't he? We were literally lying on the bed watching. Actually, you only get Fox or you get MSNBC when you're on the cruise ship. I think we were watching Fox. And he was in the Oval Office live with Zelensky. And I, hit my wife and I said, "Are you watching this? Wake up." And we saw one of the most remarkable displays of foreign policy, failure in my lifetime, I think, where he and J.D. Vance, Trump and Vance, insulted Zelensky, accused him of not being grateful for American support, attempted to sort of sit him up, told him he didn't have the cards to negotiate, kicked him out of the White House without serving lunch. It was a completely disgraceful display. And I will tell you this, because when you're on the high seas, you do have high-quality Starlink internet service. And I was able to engage in Facebook with many of my conservative friends. And for the first time in the Trump administration, you saw pushback by Reagan-era conservatives, anti-Russian conservatives, people who understand Russia is the bad guy conservatives, who said, that was a bridge too far for me. I don't know what the president's trying to do, but he's probably got a master plan someplace we just don't know about. And there were all kinds of things. I'm a mixed martial arts master, and let me tell you how he's using the weight of his opponent here. Just nonsense. Some of it probably AI generated in support of Trump. Even his strongest supporters sort of, folded their tails. And what they were not prepared for was all of the Putin puppet. He is a vassal of Russia. Putin owns him. A lot of those things I frankly posted that made Trump look weak as it compared to Putin. That runs counter against their perception of him as the master negotiator and the master of the world. And they had to confront that for the very first time. And I think that was certainly unsettling for them. It was certainly unsettling for everybody in the free world, frankly.
Yes.
Now, there are other things, too. I mean, he put tariffs on, took them off, put tariffs on, took them off. We had the shutdowns. We had furloughs. We had never mind, you're not really fired. The economy tanked while we were traveling. The stock market went down. Inflation's going up. Employment's beginning to weaken. All of that happened. And so it was a big conflagration of things, culminating with the Trump continuing to lose in the courts for the most part on his decisions.
Yet it seems to be business as usual with the Congress, the Republican Congress, and everybody else that is in the MAGA camp, right?
It is. MAGA thinks this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and they're for Donald Trump no matter what Donald Trump does. But if you begin to look at the polls, you see that there are some weak points beginning to generate. Trump's approval is at 47%. That's its highest level, but his disapproval is at 51%. On foreign policy, 45% approve, 53% disapprove. Now, on the border, 55% approve, 43% disapprove. By the way, part of the Democrats' problem is they told us you can't do anything at the border without legislation. Well, apparently that's not true. He stopped immigration at the border. He's, deporting people, didn't need legislation. And that is one of the things that's sapping the credibility of the Democrats on this issue. On the issue of deporting criminals to El Salvador, that's favored by the public 63 to 35. So on some issues, Trump is very popular. Now, on the economy, 44% approve, 54% disapprove. And that is a very dangerous red light flashing for Trump. On cost of living, 42% approve, 55% disapprove, because people have figured out that tariffs mean higher prices. Republicans have a favorability factor of 36%, 48% unfavorable. What's keeping them afloat is that the Democrats are 29% favorable, 54% unfavorable, and in the Quinnipiac poll, 21% approve of Democrats, 68% disapproved. So the Democrats are even more underwater than Trump is. But there are some really flashing red lights on the economy, on the cost of living, on foreign policy that are beginning to flash for the Trump administration.
But will it flash for the mega supporters and the mega base? Will that happen?
Not for a while.
Okay.
But it doesn't have to happen for a while because nothing, as in politics, nothing clarifies your mind like losing. And these congressional candidates all have to face the voters in 18 months. And they're going to begin to grapple with these issues, as they're already doing in their town halls,
right?
From people who say, listen, I voted for Trump, but I didn't want my son to lose his job at the Park Service. And here's the thing about it. These cuts are going to disproportionately impact red states, as we've talked about before. Alaska and West Virginia, for example, disproportionately have a federal workers in the workforce. And in both states, they are disproportionately among the higher paid workers in those states. Medicaid has a much deeper reach in red states like Mississippi and South Carolina and Alabama than it does in the blue states. It affects a lot more people. And those impacts are going to be real, and Congress people are going to hear about it in their meetings and in their mail.
Gotcha. Well, as unorganized as the Republican Party might be, the Democratic Party is in the worst shape I have seen in my lifetime. Am I overstating that?
No, the Democrats are having a serious problem in getting the messaging right. Part of it is because, if you just saw with the poll numbers, you can't oppose everything Trump's doing because some of what he's doing is popular. You've got to pick and choose those issues where Trump has gotten himself on the wrong side of public opinion. And it's hard to do because he keeps, shuffling the issues every day and throwing out something new, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. And it's hard for them to keep track and be coherent when they go after it. So they've got a real issue. And I've said this now, ad infinitum, Mike. The one talking point that is consistent for Democrats is they keep talking about he only wants to cut taxes for billionaires. And Harris said she's going to cut taxes for 100 million Americans. There's 349 million Americans. The other 249 have figured out that they're going to get screwed by the Democrats. And the Trump tax cuts are going to go to everybody. And in fact, there are going to be these no tax on tips and no tax on overtime and other stuff that really is not good for the economy. But people are going to feel that they got a tax cut from Donald Trump.
Right.
And when the Democrats align against that, they're going to dig themselves into a deeper hole. They've got to figure out on taxes how to understand that these tax cuts are going to everybody. If I were Trump, what I would do is I would, at $1 billion, I would not let the tax cut be extended, or I would raise taxes by 1% so we can say, hey, listen, I raised taxes on billionaires. And if they did that, the Democrats would be 6 months trying to find a talking point.
Gotcha. And of course, Chuck Schumer came under a lot of fire. You happen to agree with the route he took politically.
Well, I do, Mike. I mean, everybody says, Schumer didn't stand and fight for the Democrats. Schumer is a smart man. And here's what he realized. The party that shuts the government down gets blamed. Now, you can say Republicans are in control. They have the House, they have the Senate, and the government shut down, so it's their fault. But if all of the Republicans in the House except one vote to keep it open, and all of the senators in the Senate, Republicans, vote to keep it open except one, and all the Democrats vote to close it, that argument's not going to fly. The Democrats are going to get blamed for shutting down the government.
Right.
And, they're standing behind the filibuster rule, which a year ago they were saying was a racist Jim Crow anachronism from the old days. So they had no leg to stand on there. They would get the blame, and Chuck Schumer was smart enough to realize that. The other thing is, the reason why Trump is losing so badly in court is because, as we have talked before, we have a well-defined process in America of congressional appropriations, of apportioning money about where it goes to various cities and counties, and then appropriating it on an annual basis. All of the money in the budget has gone through that process and is legally there, and we have case law and legislation says it's therefore supposed to be spent. That's why Trump's losing in court. If you take away the appropriations, if you take away the legal authorization to spend the money, then Musk and Doge and Trump have unfettered ability to close down all of the government and not necessarily reopen it when government comes back.
Gotcha.
And again, Schumer, because he's been around a while, was smart enough to realize that. Now, it makes his base infuriated. It makes Democrats feel they're not fighting. But he saved them from a big public relations disaster.
But I think what a lot of Democrats are thinking, okay, whatever happened, happened, but where do we go from here?
I think the key for Democrats is you've got to find the guys who are losing their jobs, the Marines, the veterans who are getting laid off, highlight those people. You've got to highlight what's going to be a disastrous cut in Medicare and Medicaid for people who really need health care and the impact it's going to have on people, and then stay laser focused on the economy because Trump is self-sabotaging his own economy. You know, in the first term, and Karl Rove wrote about this week, he was smart enough because he was being led by Paul Ryan and McConnell in the Senate. He was smart enough to pass the tax cuts first so that the economy got juiced, and then he went to tariffs. Here he's doing it the opposite direction. He's doing tariffs that are going to sink the economy. Then he'll do tax cuts, and the tax cuts may or may not be enough to revive the economy and the stock market after the damage of the tariffs. And that's because he has mediocre people advising him, frankly, and because he's giving in to his own worst impulses. Because of that, he may or may not get the credit for the economic revival. And Democrats need to focus on the economy because people are perceiving the cost of living is staying high, unemployment is getting worse, the stock market is tanking, and inflation is high. So that's the opportunity.
Is there anybody in the Democratic Party that you see that can unite the Democratic Party? Because as I've said on this broadcast before, anytime you have a country that has one party that dominates, that's not healthy for the country. So how do we get the Democratic Party at least healthy enough to keep our democracy going? And who specifically would be the leadership that would do that you see?
I spent a lot of time listening to Al Fromm, who was one of the advisors in the Democratic leadership group that helped Bill Clinton come out of, losing 3 elections to bring the Democratic Party back by focusing on the middle, by focusing on pocketbook issues, and by focusing on a record of good governance. So I believe that a candidate who is probably a governor, somebody who's governed from the middle, somebody who has a record of accomplishment, not necessarily Gavin Newsom, but somebody like Andy Beshear from Kentucky, who I understand, by the way, is in San Francisco today, working the rooms, has the opportunity to articulate a message. I think the key is you listen to them, and how many words does it take for the words common sense get used will tell you whether they're a serious candidate or not, because people are looking for common sense answers that affect them where they live and affect them in their pocketbook.
Josh Shapiro, is he a possible?
Josh Shapiro certainly has the potential of being one as well. He's certainly done a good job, according to the voters in Pennsylvania.
Okay, let's wrap this up, but let's wrap it up with what you see as the potential outcome of all that we've talked about today.
Well, Mike, I have 2 scenarios for you. The scenario I think is most likely is that because he's trying to do all of these things at once, Trump is going to trip himself up. He's going to overplay his hand. He's going to crash and burn because of overreach. There will be too many unintended consequences in terms of important government programs that get either shut down permanently or shut down temporarily. Too many people who get laid off that shouldn't have been laid off. Too much impact on red state America. Failure in foreign policy. Putin just tells him, no, we're not going to do what you want us to do. And he looks like a fool on that. We continue to alienate ourselves from our allies and from NATO. China and others begin to take advantage of that. And the economy continues to crash. And when that happens, people are going to say, okay, I've had enough chaos. We want the adults in the room to take over again. I actually think that is a fairly likely scenario. But there is another scenario. And that is, what if it all works? Trump could end the war. I mean, Putin could decide, okay, I've got really what I want, and I can live with, French troops in Ukraine. I can live with Americans running the nuclear power plant. I can live with, as long as I get investment, as long as I get to my assets unfrozen, that kind of thing. The tax cuts are very important and could rescue the economy and provide new economic lift, particularly if he continues to do his, bait and switch and feint on the tariffs, and they're not as bad as he is proposing. That could work. The border is secure, and he's getting credit for that. The budget is cut in ways that people believe are appropriate, but doesn't cut important programs. And we saw this with Panama. Here's a very important thing. He made all this noise about China and Panama. What happened is that the company in Hong Kong sold the operating rights of the two ports at either end to the American company BlackRock. Now, that is a win for America. That takes away the China threat. That sort of solves the problem that he was doing. Maybe we get bases in Greenland so that we don't have to annex it or buy it or conquer it. We're going to get Ukrainian minerals. And the Dems continue to be in the wilderness. They really haven't got a coherent plan. Under that scenario, Donald Trump is going to ride pretty high, and Republicans will be reelected in 2026. I think that's less likely a scenario to happen.
Okay, so you're going with the first scenario then.
I think that's more likely to happen.
Well, and then if the second scenario takes place, and if Steve Bannon is correct, Trump will run in 2028.
Well, he can't run. There'll be a constitutional crisis, and we have an entirely new set of cascading problems. But that is for another show.
That is for another show. But a good way to close it out. By the way, everybody that on both sides that has heard what Bannon says, it's crazy talk. So that was just thrown out for pure humor and entertainment purposes.
How can he wakes up every day and says, "How can I rile up America with something utterly, completely outrageous?" And he caught a good one with that one.
Yeah, he sure did. All right. Well, we don't know when we'll be back, but because we're all on vacation all the time. And, vacations take precedence over everything. So, but I want to thank you, Keith. You'd laid it out perfect again, as usual. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do. Give us a high rating where you can on iTunes and other places. And thanks for joining us for another edition of Red versus Blue.
Thanks, everybody. Stay strong, America.